Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here in person and virtually. My name is Tracy Johnson, and I'm the Assistant Conservator here at the Georgia Archives. Our pre-program conservation internship is something we're very proud of here, and it wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship of the Friends of the Georgia Archives of History. We are so appreciative that they've been able to fund this experience for many years, which helps us support our mission of increasing the opportunities for conservation training available here in the East. This year's intern, Ms. Kayla Moorhead, has been a pleasure to have in the lab for the last 20 weeks. Her enthusiasm and passion for conservation is infectious, and her desire to advocate for the profession, as well as be an alternate voice so desperately needed in the field of cultural heritage, is inspiring. She's sure to be a positive and influential force as she continues her path into conservation. Now that I've probably embarrassed her, please welcome Kayla Moorhead.
Morning, everyone. My name is Kayla Moorhead, and I'm the pre-program conservation this year. Let's get straight into it. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about myself. I'm from Marietta, Georgia, born and raised. I'm currently an undergraduate student at Georgia State University studying studio art. I started exploring the world of conservation at the beginning of the pandemic. I actually reached out to an art history professor when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in the arts, and I spoke with her about conservation. She reached out to a student who was currently setting up their undergraduate degree for a master's in conservation, which is usually a major in fine arts and a minor in chemistry. After speaking to her, she recommended that I speak with Sigourney Smuts, the state conservator at the Georgia Archives. Through speaking with Sigourney, I learned about the conservation workshops that they offered, and I started taking them there, where I also met the wonderful assistant conservator, Tracy Johnson. And I'm currently in the process of setting up my undergraduate education and work experience for a career in conservation. The process goes as follows. You would major in fine arts with a minor in chemistry. While in school or after, you would gain practical experience through internships, fellowships, or bench training. In between getting your experience and before applying to graduate school, you would curate a portfolio of all your projects, and you would apply to graduate school or continue bench training. Once you've accomplished that, you would go into art conservation and hopefully become a conservator. There are only 4 master's programs in the United States that offer a master's degree in conservation. University of Delaware has the Winterthur program that is art conservation. It has more specialties available. Buffalo State is a little bit similar. It has more options, which are art conservation and cultural heritage, conservation science and imaging, which is a mouthful. NYU has a dual program in art conservation and art history, and UCLA has a conservation of archaeological and ethnographic materials if you have more of an interest in objects conservation. These programs are about 3 to 4 years. You would spend your first 2 years learning the theoretical side of conservation, then you would spend your last 2 gaining experience in an actual internship or fellowship. I want to start off by saying why conservation? So the best way I can explain conservation is through how the AIC explains it on their website, which is the American Institute for Conservation. Conservation is preservation of cultural heritage for generations. You also have the ability to explore different specialties. That could be objects, paper, paintings, textiles, and a newer specialty, time-based media. You're also able to begin exploring connecting with different communities. I come from an African American background. Through the arts, I've been able to discover how Black art is showcased, and I feel like there's a wealth of Black art, but there's not a lot of talk about the conservation of it, so that's something that I really want to look into. Advocating for the field, conservators have a tendency to either, people, the public, either see conservation as really good or really bad. A great example is the monkey Jesus Christ, where someone had totally defaced the original face and completely destroyed the painting. And also making conservation accessible to everyone. Conservation has not always been inclusive, but it's slowly becoming so. According to the Andrew Mellon Foundation, there are only 5% individuals who are Black who work within the arts. And according to an AIC statistic, only less than 1% work as conservators. That's everything that I learned in 2 weeks. So I wanted to start off by talking about theory versus practice. This is kind of how I was able to learn about conservation in terms of making decisions and using my hands-on skills. So with theory, I want to start off by asking the question, am I following the code of ethics? There are a list of code of ethics on the AIC website that you must abide by. Am I following laws and regulations? Am I making correct judgments when talking to a client about conservation treatment? Am I being fair? Am I using the materials that are sympathetic to the original object? If I'm working on a map that has a missing corner, and am I using paper that has the same weight and texture? Are the tools and process that I'm applying appropriate for the treatment? Should I humidify or flatten a painting or a artwork that has pastels on it? Am I following the mission and the policies of the institution I'm working for? The Georgia Archives mission is to identify, collect, and preserve Georgia historical material, as well as make it accessible to the public. As far as practice, do I understand conservation terminology? When I'm writing condition and treatment reports, am I using correct terminology? How's my dexterity? How familiar am I with the tools and materials being used? Am I comfortable with using an X-Acto knife to cut a slit to open the spine of a book? Can I pay attention to detail? And am I able to communicate conservation concerns to my colleagues? If a colleague comes to me that does not work in the field of conservation and they have a concern about a historical material, am I able to translate my knowledge to them? So, excuse me, one of my first projects that I started working on in the lab with Tracy and Sigourney was bookbinding. And so bookbinding is the process of gathering signatures, trimming and folding a standard size sheet of Mohawk paper. Then once you have your signatures together, you will sew that into a text block using sewing linen thread and tapes and cords, not literal tape, cotton tape. And then you will put your text block into a standing press and use a backing hammer to round the spine. And then once you've rounded the spine, you will use some sort of material to protect the spine and add extra support, which could be cambric, super or mold, or even Mohawk paper. Once you have your spine together, you will then assemble the outer case with book cloth, 2 boards, and a spine card. You will then position the text block into this case to make sure that everything fits correctly. And then you will paste down your end sheets. And then voila, you have a book. And so with preparing or working on bookbinding, the intention was to understand the structure so that I could reverse engineer the book to work on book repairs. So while working with Sigourney, she taught me that I needed to know the difference between rare books and reference books in order to understand how to approach them with treatment. And then after understanding that, I could write condition reports and treatment proposals. Condition reports are what you use to write and explain assess the damage of the book, so what's happening. For example, with the green book, there was some of the spine was missing at the top, exposing the Oxford Hollow, which is just used to add extra support in the spine lining as well as the headband. You can see that there are abrasions around the corners of the cover boards, especially the book cloth peeling back and exposing the board underneath. You can also see that there is a page sticking out a little bit, and there's like a small tear. So considering all that and how I would go about it. So with rare books, you would approach with minimal treatment. The goal is to keep as much of the original material as possible. Rare books is only usually one or only a few that are left in the entire world. Rare books should also be kept in closed stacks, which is considered a more secured area for housing. That does not mean it's not accessible, it just needs to be in safe conditions for the time that it's being put away.
And some of the terminology that I've used in my condition reports and treatment proposals were abrasions, detached leaves, consolidating corners, infills, recto, verso, and etc. As for reference books, these books are usually being cycled through the library and are open to the public and being used. You can either replace them if the situation like the dog ate my homework happened and there's just no way to replace it at all. Fix it at all. You can just replace it and buy another copy. New materials can be used. Say that the book cloth is totally gone from the front and back cover boards. You can literally, and the title is still there. You can literally cut out the title and paste it onto a new book cloth and onto the book itself. And it will be returned to OpenStax, which is considered like a library or the reference library here at the Georgia Archives. And some of the terminology I used for book repairs were splits along the hinges. I had to detach the spine, the front cover board and the back cover board so that I could feed Japanese tissue paper to bring them back together. And then as you can see here on the right, that's from all that debris, it's just from taking off the end sheets as that was destroyed. And then I also had to hinge back a few pages that were detached with Japanese tissue paper, which is a very thin but strong fibrous paper. And then the last picture is of me using toned Japanese paper, which I painted with paint to match the color of the original book cloth. So once I've understood books, book structure, and I've done some book repairs, I started making box enclosures, which provide structural support for big and small, fragile and broken books. And depending on the condition is what book enclosure you would use. So starting from the left, here's the Mylar jacket, which is useful for books that aren't really damaged or are still intact. And this protects it from dust and dirt and other external factors. Here's a wrapper. It's great for fragile thin books. It's used with lightweight archival board. And then here on the bottom two, you have cases for pamphlet binders, so just for small pamphlets, not meant for heavy books. And then all these were put into a face box. And face boxes are good for thicker books or books that are super rare and that need extra protection from like light, temperature fluctuations and things of that nature. And an external project that we worked on were city directories. They're these very thick books that have the outer casing detached from them from overuse and mishandling. So the best option that Tracy and Sigourney decided was to put them into face boxes. It's also important to note that it is convenient to have your own materials to make book enclosures, but depending on time and resources, it may be easier and more efficient for some institutions to buy pre-made enclosures, which are also available on popular archival websites. And so my last project that I got to work on were maps. To your left, you see a collection of maps that were from Bryan County. They're all pretty recent, so they're not in severe condition. I was able to perform dry surface cleaning, which is just cleaning the surface of a map with something like makeup sponges, which you usually wouldn't think of. And those are actually makeup sponges from cleaning the maps that are dirty. And I remember being taught to always clean from the center to the edge, because if you clean too close to the edge, you risk ripping the map, especially since tears are usually along the map, which are the most vulnerable part of it. I also use a water pen with deionized water and remoldable tissue, which is just pre-made Japanese tissue paper and wheat starch paste. So you just brush wheat starch paste onto a sheet of Japanese tissue paper, and then you transfer it to Mylar and let it dry. And once it's dry, you can just cut off pieces of the Japanese tissue paper for quicker use. And then I also did local flattening, which is just taking a water pen and applying it to crinkles or wrinkles or areas that are folded instead of just taking the whole map and humidifying it. And for the next map, which was the Georgia map of 1854, this was the map that I worked on, Sigourney. This poor map is very brittle.
it was covered with varnish, which is never something that you should do when trying to preserve a map. It also was lined with fabric. Since paper expands and fabric contracts, that is just a recipe for disaster and causes a lot of stress for the map over time. We also did some dry cleaning. We discovered that as we were dry cleaning, a lot of the map started to fall apart because it was brittle, and all the things that were happening with the map was causing it just to deteriorate. So Sabrina decided to use solvent to try different types of solvent to try and see if she could take the varnish off. And due to time and resources, we figured that that was not the case. That was not something that we should do because it would take almost a minute for her to just do a spot that was like this small. So after speaking with Hendry, our collections manager, she decided that it's just best to cut the map into 4 pieces. And she was able to do that without taking away any information, cut them into 4 pieces and put them into Mylar so that way when they are stored and they need to come back out to be viewed, they can just be assembled back together. As far as other opportunities and projects, I was able to work on a few exhibits here. You can see in the first image that I'm removing take that piece of residue, which is that ugly yellow stain at the bottom. Over time, tape tends to harden and cross-link, and at that point, it's impossible to do anything else. So it's staying permanently. And so we just did that for the, to protect whatever was adhered to it before, or taped to it before. At the bottom, you can see Tracy setting up an exhibit. That's something that she does here a lot, and she does an amazing job. I also was able to go on tours. I visited the Emory Preservation Lab, and that was wonderful. Ipranetta, she showed us around, who previously worked there and is now the head of preservation at Emory. She showed us around, gave us a tour. And during that tour, the assistant conservator there, Julie Newton, showed us a 19th century surgical kit. I also got to walk around with Tracy and view data loggers to check relative humidity and temperature fluctuations, which is really important to the historical materials of the Georgia Archives. If there is a temperature drop or the temperature is too high, that could definitely affect a lot of the materials like microfilm or fragile objects that we have in our bulk. And at the bottom, you can see that I'm working on a Mylar encapsulation demo. This was actually, I was actually creating L sleeves for the previous map that I explained, the very brittle one. And also another cool thing about working in the archives is filming. We have a lot of filming that goes on. The last couple of weeks, there has been at least filming once a week. Tracy is responsible for scouting. A lot of the people walking the film scouts through the building to see if they want to film here. So I've been a part of that, and also been a part of watching the film crew and production setup and everything. Another amazing opportunity that I got to experience was Journal Club. So each week, Tracy, Sigourney, and I would choose one article that talked about the ethics or the theory and practice of conservation. As you can see here, there's a lot more that we did, more than this. So the first one that I did was toning Japanese tissue papers, and that's just seeing what type of materials people use to tone Japanese tissue paper. So that could be acrylic paint, watercolors, colored pencils, a lot of other materials that you shouldn't be using. And my favorite that we discussed was the one about race, diversity, and politics by Sanchita, which she spoke at an AIC event about race and how there's a lack of inclusivity and how we should be having these conversations, especially since we're working with cultural heritage. And when we work in a sector that talks about cultural heritage and is not inclusive, what conversations are we having behind closed doors that are inviting these cultures in? Are we preserving these objects correctly? A lot of the objects in conservation may be ceremonial. Are these objects should these objects be exhibited? So just creating those connections. And I want to end the presentation by talking about mistakes and lessons learned. When I first started the internship, I was a little frustrated because I felt that I was doing everything wrong. So I just created a list of lessons learned, and it starts with it takes practice. Nothing is going to come to you easy automatically. Mistakes are not automatic failures. If it feels awkward at first, it's normal. It was definitely awkward for me when using certain tools or putting materials together. Conservation requires continuous learning and shared ideas. You'll never reach a limit with conservation. The goal is to share ideas and innovative ways to treat objects and preserve them. Communication is key. If you have a concern about something or you're not sure what to do, always ask your colleagues or the conservators that you're working with. And most importantly, remember that you are human. We're all human, we're not robots. We don't magically turn things into what they were before. That's not the goal. And with that, I want to thank FOGAH, Sigourney, Tracy, and all the Georgia Archive staff. It's been so wonderful working with you guys. You've been amazing. And I'd also like to share that I'll be working as a preservation technician here at the Georgia Archives, and I'll be continuing my work with the team. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? Either online or? Yes.
I thoroughly enjoy your presentation, and I just enjoyed watching her just when she started speaking her own language, like the language of conservators. It's like, I'm like, yeah, you talked over my head, but you did a really, really good job. I appreciate what you said about being able to translate your knowledge into, for lack of a better phrase, layman terms, because some of us don't really know all of the things that go into what you guys do. And I do really think you guys are magicians because you really do make magic happen. But I really appreciated the very, you illustrating the steps and the different tools and all the various things that went into it, because, you know, it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to see it. And so I liked the presentation and how clean your presentation was. It was like, I love this presentation. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking, but it was really good. And it showed that you learned a lot and you just taught, well, me a lot. So thank you for that.
Anybody else?
Any? Ditto. I want to make it that. This was really good. I so enjoyed your PowerPoint presentation. Like with Tamika, I liked, you know, the images on there and the explanation. It was wonderful. Okay, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You want to go into conservation. Are you going into paper, or are you going to? Are you not sure yet? Or
Well, Sigourney has me sold. But no, I just think there's so much that you can do with it. And one thing that Sigourney always talked to me about was that some people don't describe paper as an object and it's an actual object. It can be adhered to almost anything. People can use it for different purposes within their art. So I think it's something that just needs a little bit more attention, because objects is more of a popular specialty because of sculptures and all different materials that are that come with objects. So yeah, definitely my avenue.
Anybody else?
What was your favorite project?
Bookbinding. I really like making stuff and putting stuff together, so it smooths like my OCD and just like neatly putting things together. It was frustrating at first, but I mean, that's part of the process. So I enjoyed it, and just going through that and then just getting better over time. Really, I can see the development.
Based off of that response, what do you think was your biggest learning curve?
Ooh. Explaining the treatment process and assessing the conditions of the objects. I always tell people I'm more practical, so just getting to it is like what I like the most, but having to actually explain what's happening to the object is very necessary. So that was my biggest learning curve, because even when we talked about writing the condition and treatment reports, you have to tell me all the time, you know, you're not writing this like a fantasy novel or anything, you're just getting straight to the point, and getting straight to the point is sometimes hard for me. So that was my biggest learning curve, but I really enjoyed it.
I've got two questions. What was your least favorite project? And what was sort of the most surprising thing about conservation as a whole? Not like sort of technical details, but biggest picture surprise that you learned.
If I could kind of tack on to Henry, your least favorite project or what you found, what technique you found more frustrating than others.
Okay, good one. Least favorite is the book repairs, I hate to say, because that's the most important. It was just,
So you're separating the binding from the repair?
yes,
Okay.
yes, because with the book repairs, it's like, you're having to repair, you could come across anything. There are a lot of issues that you come across with books. And so what I found myself getting frustrated about was, I would start on one repair and then I would notice something else. So it would just kind of like pick up. Yes. And the hardest thing or the most frustrating thing that I had to do with book repairs were infills. Infills aren't easy because it's usually when you are, the process of infills is when you are using a material that is sympathetic to the original. So say, for example, there's a page that had a missing corner, and when the corner of something is teared off, there's a shelf tear that's left. When you use a material that's sympathetic to it, you have to mimic that shelf tear. And so you're literally using a very small scalpel to just shave away the paper. And so just imagine what it's like if the paper was thin, you have to do that. So just carving away for hours, then you have to fit it and try to see if it's right. If it's not right, then you have to go back. And so it's very tedious, but it's worth it. That's something. And then going back to your question about something I found interesting about conservation as a whole. That's a good question because there's so much. I hope this answers it. I think this goes back to this conversation about being a magician. I was under the assumption that there were these like crazy techniques that you had to do in order to prepare a lot of the objects, but it's not. It's just, the goal is to stabilize it and not fix it. I know that you said not what specifically to treatment, but I think that's what I found more amazing about it. And also that conservation is actually a very small field. Once you know one person, you know everybody. So that makes it easier for communication and getting ideas across, making connection.
Thank you.
Did you say that there was 1% of art students that went into conservation?
No, I was saying it was,
Black art students?
yeah, there's less than 1% of Black conservators in conservation.
Wow,
As well as other minorities.
that's crazy.
And it has to do a lot with just like social and economic relations. So, for example, and just in general, a lot of students aren't able to travel to different cities. A lot of conservation hubs are like in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and New York. A lot of these institutions are expecting the interns that they're hiring to come to these places while being unpaid or not paying well enough. New York, rent is almost like $2,000 and up, and you would have to find a roommate. You have to get transportation, how would you buy groceries? So considering all that, and then also just a lot of that culture not being accessible to the cultures they come from, a lot of cultural heritage not being accessible to the culture they come from. So the conservators are making their own decisions and assumptions on how they should preserve them without reaching out. So there's a lot of that and a lot of history, just general history behind it.
So the journal article that you read, did that address that?
Yes, it did. It did. She actually made a great point talking about how if we're not, it's more than representation. It's also what conversations are we having without other voices being involved. Sometimes when we're thinking of our own ideas, we make up assumptions of how something should go. So she said, why not invite other voices in to make those decisions as well? And that can cause like a confusion.
I want a copy of the race article.
I'll send it to you.
Awesome.
Thank you. You ready online? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you, Kayla.
Thank you, especially again to FOGAH. Without important, again, to be able to have these opportunities for, especially because as they were saying that we are not really one of those hubs. So we're trying to. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.